The Pan-African Baraza is an initiative of ThoughtWorks, which is a very unusual organization. This is going to be the first of a series of monthly meetings that we will hold.
ThoughtWorks is 20 years old. We're a technology consulting and software company. We build custom software, and it's what we're most known for. We are in 14 countries, 3,000 employees. We are a different company. This belief that we can actually change humanity through technology is so ingrained in who we are. This is not a CSR effort by any stretch of the imagination. This is who we are. And we felt that the way we've been doing it in other countries has been a bit misguided, or maybe should I say a little bit more of the status quo. And we needed to change the narrative about the way we approach Africa. And so we looked at Pan-Africanism and what lessons there were to learn from there. There's self-determination.
We want to try to open up debate, discussion from a progressive, radical perspective, with an agenda that is about the emancipation of our people on this continent and beyond. We're very, very pleased today to be able to have our first speaker here, Lewis Gordon. And I hope each of you will join us in that process of discussion, debate, and imagination that will lead to us inventing the future that we want, not those who want to steal from us. But this is the first time I've seen a Jewish comrade with dreadlocks and a tam, so it's really great. But what was very special is that he is going to be talking about part of that reclaiming the past, about Fanon. Fanon, who's 90, who would have been 90 today, or this year.
Well, Hamjambo. And you see, you've heard I'm Jamaican, so I could also say, how you keeping? And if some of you observe, I don't speak with my shoes on. Many reasons for that. Some people have seen on different speeches I've given, you know. Some of them is the establishment of a sacred space where you speak truth. Others would say, it's because he's comfortable. And then some people say, you know, he's from Jamaica and maybe they just don't wear shoes there. But you know, all could be true, and they're all true. Thanks, Feroz, for that introduction. And I'd also like to say thank you, Lena Same, and Wanjia Najoya, and all of you who are here. You have taken a break from your holiday to come and spend some time with me. And I have taken also a break for a variety of reasons. The first one is, as Feroz said, this is the 90th year of Fanon's birth. So people are writing and talking about Fanon all over the world. Fanon understood his commitment not only to the globe, to those in the global south, but his commitment to Africa was such that I wanted to make sure that the very first lecture for Fanon's 90th year, for 2015, that I give on Fanon, takes place on this continent. So I thank you for joining me in this celebration of Fanon. Now, before I continue, there's some other things I should say. You know, a lot of people don't realize that most Jews in the world are actually of color. And usually when people, you know, it's a shame the world has gotten to the point if they meet a black Jew, they're trying to figure out, how is that possible? And I have to make sure, you know, I'm a born Jew. My mother's from Palestinian Jews and from Irish Sephardic Jews. And in Judaism, your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. There's more to it. And as you know, you have a neighbor that has quite a few Jews around. But the complicated thing is Jewish history is distorted in ways. And believe it or not, Fanon is linked to Jewish history in a very interesting way. So that's one thing. The second thing is, as you could see, Feroz and I came properly dressed. You know, he's wearing his Cabral shirt. Now, I have a whole lot of T-shirts I wear. One of them I've been going around with is one that says danger, educated black man. However, I chose this one, okay? And we already know that this is part of the struggle, not only around the question of Black Lives Matter, but it's also around the struggle. You know, we saw the graphic, asphyxiation of a black man on Staten Island. And it's really poignant that this message is also connected to something Fanon in a book called Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. Fanon basically says something that people don't often hear. He said, revolution is truth. And he said that this truth is the oxygen through which you can establish a new humanity. And so one of the issues we're facing all over the world, the reason you have people everywhere talking about Black Lives Matter, I can't breathe, and the many statements that are going around is because, in fact, all across this planet, humanity is being asphyxiated. A lot of us are choking, and a lot of us are reaching out for that oxygen we're trying to breathe. So already, even those who haven't heard the name Fanon, they're already articulating a Fanonian situation. The next thing I like to bring up is, he's 90. Fanon was born in 1925, July 20th, 1925. You know who else was born that year? Malcolm X. Patrice Lumumba. Yeah, I know there's some folks here who say the word God. Well, God that year must have been saying, this might be a year for some revolutionaries. You know what I mean? And, when you look at this, what Feroz said is right. This question, what has happened if we look at the world today, when we look at young people? When many of us don't realize when we read the writings of Fanon, we are talking about the ideas of a young man. Fanon's first book was written when he was 25. The classic for which he's known, Le Damné de la Terre, The Damned of the Earth. You all know it as The Wretch of the Earth, but there are reasons later I'll talk about why I prefer to say The Damned. He wrote that when he was 35. Wrote it in 10 weeks, by the way. And when we think about this question about Fanon at that time, we begin to ask ourselves some real important other questions. Because you see, why is it that young people today are constantly being told? You know what a lot of the young people in this room are told constantly? You all know it. You're always being told what you can't do. And one of the reasons you're constantly being told what you can't do is because you're living under the social condition of perpetual infantilization. You see, in Fanon's world, all you're thinking about with it when you're a boy or you're a girl is when you're going to be a man or a woman. Now we got even middle-aged people trying to act like they're still children. And what happens to ideas when people no longer have a sense of maturation is that we have a stagnation of thought. So we're going to back up a little. I'm going to talk a little about Fanon. The other thing I want to say about Fanon, and this may surprise many of you, is that Fanon really, really, really wanted to be wrong. A lot of what he wrote about, there are people today who really would love for Fanon to be wrong. But one of the tragedies is that if he were to come around and see the things he was right about, he would be very unhappy. And this already tells you something, because we're talking about a way of thinking that is so humanistic that even when you see the truth and you speak the truth, you hope the truth could be wrong. It was almost like giving a diagnosis and you hope there will be miracles. So we begin with who this person was. Well, Fanon was born in 1925 on the island of Martinique. He was from a family in which there were 8 children, 4 boys, 4 girls. 2 of the girls died. And Fanon, as he grew up as a child, was a rather unusual child. In fact, one of the things he confessed to his brother Joby, he said, "I won't live long." You ever wonder what it's like to meet people who know they're not going to live long? I remember, and then there are these people who get surprised. I was talking with Harry Belafonte last year, and as I was walking with him, I said something, Harry, it's funny, Harry Belafonte is one of these people where no matter how famous he is, everybody calls him Harry. I said, Harry, I have a theory about you. And he said, "Well, what is it, Louis?" I said, "You didn't expect to live long, did you?" And he said, "No." And in fact, his decision, his commitment to the idea that he wasn't going to live long, meant he understood there were things to do. And this is one of the reasons why, although you know someone like Harry Belafonte as a recording artist, as an entertainer, as an actor, what you don't know is that he's a person who took money to found SNCC. You don't know the times the Ku Klux Klan tried to kill him. You don't know the fact that he was involved in a lot of struggles similar to the ones we're talking about right now. And when we come to someone like Fanon, when he thought about this, the thing about Fanon that you don't know is that he also thought about death in a very strange way. Now, one of the things that's strange about the way he thought about death was, for Fanon, death, and this is, I'm very serious about death, and he wrote about this in his plays, death was white. Yeah, every time he wrote about death, it was about the whiteness. So a lot of people didn't understand that for Fanon, the demystification of whiteness was also the demystification of death. And his concern with confronting death was such that he took seriously an issue that many people may overlook. For instance, when you say the name Frantz Fanon, many people automatically say the word violence. In fact, you can't even finish the name. You say Frantz Fanon, violence. You know what I mean? And it's as if the man is only known for violence, when a lot of people don't know that Fanon detested violence. And this is because a lot of people don't know what violence means. You see, Fanon was born in a colonial world. And in a colonial world, Fanon understood something that many of you here understand. It's one of the reasons I'm wearing this t-shirt. Because you see, in a colonial world, in a racist world, in an anti-black world, in a world that questions your humanity, then those who do not belong, so to speak, within the realm of the human, violate that world simply by appearing. So in effect, Fanon understood violence as a condition into which he was born. And being born into violence, it becomes then a situation in which, if he were to do nothing about it, it would mean being complicit with ongoing violence. So in effect, Fanon had a critique of the people who claim to be anti-violence. You ever meet anti-violence people? Anti-violence people valorize pacifism. They tell you, oh, no, 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 there are always other ways and so forth. But they don't explain why they go to sleep at night when so many other people are suffering, when so many other people are being crushed under the heels of brutal police forces, when so many people are suffering from genocidal activities across the world, when so many people are just slowly dying from starvation. They sleep well at night, yet they could walk through the world claiming they're anti-violence. So for Fanon, the problem with that is that if your anti-violence means doing nothing about violence, then you are actually an agent of violence. For Fanon, if you are not actively doing something, then you are a hypocrite to the very question of human dignity. The second thing I like to bring up is something from his childhood. When Fanon was a little boy, there's a woman who was killed, and he heard there was an autopsy going on in the church nearby. This is, it's a small island, it's where they did. So he went to see this. And when he witnessed the autopsy, it so disgusted him because Fanon realized that to see a human being's entrails opened, to see the body there, was such an abrogation of dignity that it disgusted him. His anti-violence, in other words, was connected to his profound position that the humanity of every human being matters. Every colonial, regime had their categories, as Malcolm X talked about, of good Negroes and bad Negroes. And you know who the bad ones were? Anyone who would stand up to colonialism. The problem in the French world was that each area of the French world had their categories of so-called good versus bad. And Martinicans were treated as being more French, more civilized, more, well, less black. So as these folks walked around with this sense of their superiority to other blacks, suddenly they were in a world in which there were all of these French soldiers on the island. They were going around tutuing them, that's speaking to them in the diminutive. There were people who were basically just raiding the women over the island, and they were beating up black men. And Fanon, by the way, was, as we say today, totally gangster. He wouldn't take anything, any crap. So when he was insulted by a white soldier, you know what he did? He kicked his ass. And this was very, very important. Because you see, a lot of people don't realize this. As these people were beating up these people on the island, what Fanon realized was that he had to stand up for himself. And within that framework, Fanon realized that he was part of something larger than himself. So Fanon volunteered to fight against the Nazis in World War II. Now, when he decided to do this, his lycée professor, high school professor, one of them said, "Fanon, what are you doing? Don't you know you're going to fight a white man's war?" And Fanon had a response. He said, "Wherever there is the degradation of human dignity, wherever there's suffering, wherever man or humanity is threatened, I will fight against it." And they said, "Well, go ahead, man. It's your funeral." So Fanon went to Dominica, trained, and went to fight against the Nazis when he was 19 years old. However, Fanon saw something that many of you see all the time. You see, one of the things that colonialism and racism do is to create a world of double standards, of two-ness. So even if you're going to go fight for France, the blacks who volunteered to fight for France were put in the hull of ships like slaves, while the whites who volunteered were put up top. Then one of the other indignities come into play, because you see, one of the things I argue in my writings is it's an error, it's a fallacy to talk about race issues as if they could be disaggregated from gender and class issues. The black woman, a lot of people don't realize black women volunteered to fight against Nazis. Where were these black women placed? They were told they had to sleep in the bedrooms of the white officers. So they were being sexualized within that moment. They're fighting for the freedom of France. But then Fanon landed on in North Africa, on the continent. And you know when you were blacks come to Africa for the first time, it's like, yo, we're going to the continent. We're coming home. You know what I mean? So Fanon and the other Martinicans, they land on the continent. But you know, the French have a word that they use to refer to blacks. It's called le nègre. And le nègre could be translated as nigger or negro, but it often means nigger. So Fanon says, he shows up, he and his brothers and them, the crew, we're on the continent, brothers. And the Arabs, the Berbers, and others, would look at them and say, nègres. And they were like, yo, who are you talking to? I'm coming here to fight, and I'm being called nigger on the continent. And then Fanon and them went, and they want to show they were being treated in terrible ways. The view was the worst of the soldiers were the Senegalese, but, they wore special hats to show that they were Martinicans. And then the French decided, well, if you're Martinicans, you're more like whites, so they put them in the cold areas to fight. And you could imagine being from the Caribbean and you're suddenly in the Alps. You know, being white may be a prize, but it's damn cold. And then when they liberated villages, they found the people they were liberating were also calling them niggers and deprecating names. Fanon volunteered for the most dangerous missions, was twice decorated. But even at the end of the war, the black soldiers, this happened for with the Americans as well, the black soldiers were sent ahead in cargo ships. Could you imagine that? You were originally brought over slaves and you're sent back in cargo ships? And they were sent with bare rations. There was no parade. There was no welcoming. He was sent back to Martinique. And when the former lycée professor said to him, Fanon, you fought for France for human dignity. Whose war was it? And Fanon said, it was a white man's war. Fanon then went and fought for Aimé Césaire to be the mayor of Fort-de-France under the communist ticket. And from there, I had a great discussion with Feroz about this. Decided as a war veteran, he had a full scholarship to go study. And by the way, I'm just giving this biography for people who are not as familiar, since I hear that his biography is less known on the continent now. So he talked with his friends, and they decided that Fanon will go to France and study to be a dentist. And in my book, I talk about, you could imagine all of the issues, revolutionary dentist. And I won't get into the puns, especially with my good friend Feroz here, because he was also a dentist. Anyway, he decided to leave there and go to Lyon, where he studied psychiatry. And that is where Fanon got involved. One of the things that we have to bear in mind, several things, because I'm going to skip over his biography a little. He got his medical degree there. But among the things with Fanon is in World War II, he was also among those who were liberating concentration camps. So for Fanon saw with a very clear way what dehumanization can do at the level of brutality. You also should understand within the context that Fanon, within that context in which he lived, the category of Jew was more amorphous because he knew African Jews, he knew European Jews. But also, what some of you may not know is he has 2 children. His first child was with a Jewish woman. So Mireille Fanon Mendes France, his daughter, is Jewish. His second child was with someone who's Gypsy and Corsican, and that's Olivier. But Olivier was born after Fanon returned to Martinique. Now, again, when we talk about Fanon and violence, a lot of people, again, because they're so obsessed at the idea of a black man talking about violence. And part of the hypocrisy of it is that for a lot of people, they don't admit it's not about a black man talking about violence, because for a lot of people, black men are violence. You know, we already know this. There's sometimes all you got to do to be violent as a black man is to just walk into a room. You know, here I am, violence. We could ask about the situation with black women, but the complicated thing with black women, especially in the history of colonialism, this is another context in which I've written about it, is that on the colonialism and racism, and there's a complex history of how gender functions with it, if you write the humanity out of women, there's this construction of black women as unviolatable. Do you know what that means? If you're unviolatable, it means that anything can be done to you because it's not being done to a person. The scores, the complex history of rape and degradation of black women aren't even written in the history books as violence, because there's a presupposition that of black women as an empty slate on which to place one's force. I bring this up because when Fanon returned to Martinique, when many people talk about Fanon, they talk about Fanon in the context of revolutionary violence. But they don't understand that Fanon also encountered domestic violence. One of the things when Fanon got his degree, he studied not only to be a psychiatrist, but also a forensic physician. He was, in other words, a medical detective. And if you read his writings as a medical detective, you could see how he investigates the colonial situation. Well, when he came to the island, he came across records that didn't look right. And it was of a woman who had died. So he had her exhumed. And he determined from doing an autopsy on her that she was a victim of domestic violence. And he pushed the case, and the authorities would do nothing about it. And so Fanon began to realize that if he's going to deal with certain social issues, it isn't enough to do it at the psychiatric level. It has to get to the governing political levels. And so Fanon went back and studied to be what's called a chef de service. This gave him the power to be the head of a psychiatric facility. And this led to him going to Blida Wanville in Algeria. And this is where Fanon, as many people know Fanon, begins. Because you see, when he went to Algeria, while he was there, he began to implement very different ways to practice psychiatry. That a lot of mental illness emerged from people not being treated like people. So he argued that psychiatric facilities, if they were more human-oriented, if they were more social, they can create an environment conducive to mental health. Well, while he was there, as many of you know, the Algerian War broke out. And Fanon found himself in this very untenable situation, because he found himself having a patient who would come in and say, "Doctor, doctor, I need your help. What happened? Oh, I tortured someone today. I feel so guilty. Help me be better." Now you could imagine this. Help me be better. Let me learn to torture without a conscience. But then you'll also have a patient come later, "Doctor, doctor, help me. What's the matter? I was tortured. What did they do? Oh, they cut off my testicles. They jabbed me in the eye. They raped me. They did this." What is Fanon supposed to do? Make you well-adjusted to being tortured? And so Fanon began to point out a fundamental problem, that we have to take seriously what a sick society is. He began to train people at the hospital. He began to set up techniques of how to resist divulging information on a torture. And of course, this would mean eventually he would be arrested. Fanon eventually, though, resigned. And by the way, if you ever want to know how to write a good resignation letter, read Fanon's resignation letter. You see, there are resignation letters you hand or mail to your boss, but Fanon's resignation letter is the kind that you like throw on the desk. You know what I mean? You know, it had great sentences like, "Madness is one of man's ways of escaping his freedom." And after this, his resignation and it's coming out that he was going to join the FLN made him an enemy of France. But before Fanon did this, he went in 1956 to the Black Writers Congress in Paris. And it was rather amusing because, you know, Fanon had already began to develop techniques on how to travel because, you know, if you start doing revolutionary activities, particularly on the side of the opposition for your country, there are people who would try to kill you. So he learned to travel under aliases. So it's rather amusing. Fanon at the Black Writers Congress showed up as, I mean, everybody knew he was Frantz Fanon. He gave a great talk on racism and culture, but he showed up as Aimé Césaire. So if you read James Baldwin's discussion of the conference, he said, you know, there were two Aimé Césaires. The young one was really charismatic. Anyway, Fanon made his way to Tunisia. His family joined him, and the revolutionary was at work. A lot of people in the academy read about Michel Foucault and his critique of madness, and a lot of people don't pay attention to the fact that he did a lot of his studies when he was in Tunisia. And that meant he had to have been drawing on the work of Frantz Fanon. And there's not a single reference to Frantz Fanon in that man's writings. And this is something you should pay attention to. And it's going to connect to a lot of what I'm talking about. Because you see, when we talk about intellectuals in the global south, the first thing we have to understand these ideas is we have to free ourselves of the notion that thought is only legitimate if it comes from the mouth or the writing of people who are white. Now, I'm not against white people. I'm against the idea of making white people into gods. And one of the errors we make is we tend to use in the academy the idea that ideas, theory, must be white. And what do you look for from black people or people of color? You look for experience. We're to be studied, but explained through whiteness. But the problem, of course, if you try to lock yourself into just experience, is, well, every one of you in this room have had this experience. You know the experience I'm talking about. Everyone in this room has had the experience of trying to figure out your experience. You know what I'm talking about. And if you think about it, something could happen. For the women in the room, it often happens in that moment where somebody may do a pass and you're trying to figure, There are all kinds of ways. Somebody may do something to put you down. You're like, you usually, under those circumstances, go to a friend, someone you trust, and talk about the experience. And what you're trying to do is to bring a theory to it, to figure out, is that what happened? So now you begin to see a different problem. You see, if you do not see the role you play in figuring out your experience, then you're going to be dependent on others to tell you what your experience is. And if you do that, you are locked in what's called epistemic or knowledge colonization. It's a form of dependency that will make you, in fact, not take responsibility for thought. And that means if you seek freedom or liberation, through that auspice, you would actually affirm your dependency. So the question emerges, who is responsible for thought and ideas? And the answer, in a nutshell, is everyone. But the danger is when you're black, you're told not to think, not to theorize. And often what happens is a kind of de-intellectualizing that will make many black people actually step aside from knowledge itself, the very condition that even articulates what you are. So as Fanon begins to go through this kind of a practice, you begin to find in his books this issue. You see, although Fanon was a revolutionary and engaged in many activities, the question you should ask yourself is, why did he write? Why did he write? And the other thing, when you read his books, is he didn't just write. He wrote in a way that challenged the way you write about ideas. Fanon's writings are poetic. They're full of humor. They are full of curse words. They're full of the gritty, dirty, flesh and blood human elements. His first book was actually presented as his doctoral thesis when he was 25, but it was rejected. It was entitled On the Disalienation of Le Negre. But his doctoral committee were a group of psychophysiologists, and frankly, a lot of them were pretty racist. And they were like, black man writing on black people, please. So what he did was he went and in 2 weeks wrote another doctoral dissertation. And that was on Friedreich's disease, on nervous conditions. But the interesting thing was that that thesis explored the question of how we treat people with degenerative diseases. And in it, he argued that there was a failure to take seriously the role in therapeutic practice of addressing the patient as a human being. You see? So he got his thesis in anyway, just in very turgid technical language. But then he decided he wanted to publish his original thesis, so he went to Francis Jeanson, who was a protege of Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French existentialist. And when he sent it, Francis Jeanson said, I want to publish it. It's a brilliant piece of work. Come meet me. So Fanon went to meet him and he said, I love the book. I want to publish it. And Fanon looked at him and said, oh, it's not bad for a nigger, huh? And Francis Jeanson went to the door, opened the door and said, "Get out of my office." And at that moment, Fanon smiled and said, "I can work with you." The fact that Jeanson stood up to him, for him, represented a true critical relationship. And they remained friends for the rest of Fanon's short life. But it was Jeanson who decided that the disalienation of the Negro wasn't a good title. So he suggested another title. He suggested Peau Noir Masque Blanc, translated Black Skin, White Masks. And in Black Skin, White Masks, you get a variety of theses that people did not hear before. Because you see, in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon took on the question that's crucial for anybody who's looking at work, particularly in the African diaspora. If you're going to do anything that deals with black people, and you're doing any work that deals with the condition of Africa or the global South, there are three questions you must address. What is a human being? That question is obvious because in the modern world, black people are people who have been told we're not people. The second question is the question of freedom. If you look all around, if you look at all the writings in the modern world, people talk about freedom all the time. You look at all the writings of the European intellectuals. Freedom, freedom, we're fighting for freedom, freedom. But how the hell are they talking so much about freedom when they've made more rigorous the implements of slavery and servitude? And so you have this complicated question. You have freedom linked to liberation, and you have the human question, the philosophical anthropological question. But if you think about the challenge to your humanity, and really think about this, when people are told they're not people, our instinct is to defend ourselves and say, what do you mean I'm not a human being? What you should ask is, what if that person is a low standard? Do you really want to make colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia? Do you want all those things to be the standard of what it is properly to be human? So suppose you drop all that and you say, I'm going to be the standard. The problem with that is that you may not have sufficiently interrogated yourself. And in fact, what you begin to discover is that maybe you need to interrogate the standard. And if you interrogate that standard, you begin to deal with a different kind of question. Because now you begin to ask yourself, if I'm going to be free, if I'm going to seek liberation, what am I going to become? What kind of a human being I'm going to become? And if you begin to ask those questions, this leads to the third question. How do you justify whatever you talk about? How do you justify even justification? Fanon takes on the question of what it is to be a human being. And one of the things he says is basically that most people who talk about what it is to be a human being are what he calls imbeciles. All right? And he said, since he calls a lot of people imbeciles or idiots, it's up to him to prove it. And what he brought up is the basic thing, which is people naively think that they could simply respond to these issues by simply asserting a valorization of the self. But what Fanon points out is something many of you in this room, because you actually know many of your ethnic identities know, is that there was no reason for anyone on this continent to have called his or herself black before that imposition onto them. You see, black is indigenous to the Euro-modern world, and the Euro-modern world rejects black people. So black people have the paradox, the contradiction in fact, the melancholia of being indigenous to a world that rejects us. And we face a problem that W.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and Frantz Fanon identified. If you want to know the problem in a nutshell is basically this. The problem is of being a problem. When Sartre visited the United States, for instance, he went out with Richard Wright, and he said, because, he was Sartre, and Sartre, some of you may not know, he really loved good weed. And so he said, Richard, man, could you take me to Harlem? because that was the black part of New York. So Richard Wright took him to Harlem. And they're hanging out in Harlem, and he said, Richard, you know, tell me about the black problem. And Richard Wright turned to him and said, black problem? There's no black problem. He said, there's a white problem. And that's where Jean-Paul Sartre said, the problem in Europe is not they always talk about the Jewish problem. He said, no, it's the anti-Semites problem. It's the haters problem. But you see what Du Bois pointed out, and something you all know, the moment you say you're studying black people, people start studying black people as problems instead of as people who face problems. And there is a huge distinction between that, because you see, if you look at people as people who face problems, then you could analyze the conditions that would actually lead to the social changes needed. But if you make people in themselves the problems, what are they to do? And you know what they're to do. Disappear. So in effect, the kind of argument that say, well, you know, black people disappear as black people, that makes black people into the problems. So whether we like it or not, although we were not initially black people, we are both and. You see? Many of you in the room are your ethnic identities, and you are also black people. Now, what is even more complicated about this story is that Fanon goes on and he points out the naivety of what it is to deal with reconstructing yourself willy-nilly. The place, when you think about construction the most, is language. And in fact, many people do it. People think if they could master the language, they could, you know, the French say if you could be really French, if you could speak French perfectly, you're an évolué. You're a Frenchman, you're French. You know, there are people, as you know, who try to learn Oxford English. You know, there are people, whether they learn, you know, Castilian Spanish. There are all these things, people working at it. But of course, what Fanon pointed out is that the system contradicts itself. Because for those who master the dominant language well, they are treated, as Fanon says, they're accused of starting something. They're accused of beginning to get educated. They're accused of beginning to read these nasty things like, you know, Communist Manifesto and Gramsci's prison notebooks. They start reading things like Antoine Freeman. You know who Antoine Freeman is, any of you? If you don't, you should. He was a Haitian anthropologist, lawyer, writer. In 1885, he wrote a lot about these issues of racism beyond what may you think. You begin to learn your history if you start getting educated. I mean, we talk about, for instance, Pan-Africanism. But whenever we talk about Pan-Africanism, we always talk about Pan-Africanism, for instance, only in terms of men. But did you know that one of the co-organizers of the first Pan-African Congress was a woman? Anna Julia Cooper. Do you know she wrote her doctorate on the Haitian Revolution? She wrote, for instance, a fabulous essay, if you get a chance, called What Are We Worth? In which she argued, for instance, that those who are really worth a lot are those who give more than is invested in them. And boy, a lot of the settler groups on this continent will have a problem with that, wouldn't they? Because you know how much it costs just to raise a settler? But a lot of the people who are poor, even the minute investments in some of the poor in the world, the returns are so high. She wrote about this, and she argued that in many cases of many women, so little is invested in women, yet there's so much that many women contribute. So Fanon, when he was looking at this question of construction and language, the problem is, in a nutshell, this. If you speak the dominant language a certain way and you are white, you're told you sound like a book, you sound like a professional. If you're a black professional and you speak like a professional, you know what you're told? Hey, yo, man, you're speaking white. And you see the problem. If you treat it as a contradiction of terms, to do what any other professional does, then you are treated as almost an infection of professionalism. So that means that your blackness is actually treated as that which contaminates the system. Fanon goes further in that book and examines the human sciences. And he noticed something interesting. I don't have time to go into it in detail, but many people think when he wrote on the category the woman of color and the white man, the man of color and the white man, they think he's writing about interracial relationships. He isn't. He's actually writing about this, that this normal systems in a patriarchal society should have a situation in which black women and black men are structurally different. But what Fanon discovered is that colonialism structures black men and black women into the same. Because under that system, you're only legitimate if you get what's called words of whiteness. If you actually get legitimation in that world from a category called a white man. Fanon goes even further and argues that we, when we fight against racism, don't understand the true nature of our struggle. You see, many of you have heard that racism is a conflict between the self and the other. And some people walk around saying, I don't want to be the other. But what Fanon pointed out was something rather interesting. Because you see, in Europe, there are people who are selves and others. But what racism does is to say that there are those who are not a self and not even an other. If you're in the zone of non-being, that means that you don't even appear in an ethical relationship. And if you do not appear in an ethical relationship, it means whatever is done to you is not registered as unethical. That is why so many people of color, and particularly black people, live in violence. Because literally, if you're in the zone of non-being, it means the system is legitimate when you do not appear. But now you have a problem, because it means if you appear, you have violated the system. In fact, the violence is that that which should not appear has appeared. So you could imagine, how do you now tell the system you're not being violent? It means you have to step back and go back into invisibility, into non-being. So in effect, Fanon pointed out this. Racism is not about being the other. Racism is about not even being another. So if you're struggling against racism, it requires then not even collapsing into the presumption of the kind of a language that will legitimate those who challenge your humanity. It means then that ethics is suspended, and literally the only way to fight racism, from Fanon's point of view, the only way to fight colonialism, the only way to fight global injustice is to be political. And this creates something rather interesting, because you see, if you look at the way people talk about these issues, they talk about them moralistically. People worry about who is good, who is bad. Am I a good white, a bad white? Am I a good black, a bad black? Fanon says that's all BS. That's all irrelevant. The real question is the kind of actions that are needed to create the conditions in which people can really be in ethical relationships. And so once he does this, Fanon begins to take on a different kind of question. You see, Fanon was dying from leukemia. And during this period of his life, Fanon was functioning as the representative to the provisional Algerian government in Ghana. And as he traveled through Ghana, through Mali, through different parts of the continent, and he was doing this while there were death threats, constant efforts to kill him, by the way. I mean, it's funny, I was watching The Godfather the other day. And you know the scene where, if you've seen this movie, the scene where Vito Corleone, he's in the hospital and they're trying to kill him. Well, when Fanon was injured and he was in Rome, a newspaper put, revolutionary from the FLN is in room, blah, 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 in this hospital. And when Fanon looked at the paper, he said, get me out of this room. 20 minutes after he was put to another room, some guys broke into the room with machine guns. And they're like, oh, where is he? This is the kind of life he was leading. But he always checked his blood. He was suspicious, and it turns out he had leukemia. And you have to picture this, leukemia, blood cancer. What it is to be a person who's written about race and racism dying of blood cancer. And if you think about the old language of race, they always say the blood, I have black blood, white blood, that kind of a thing. Well, Fanon's background was that his grandfather was Alsatian. And on his father's side, both sides were black, but also East Indian. And in fact, his name was Frans Omar Fanon. And the Frans with the TZ was to pronounce his name the way the Alsatians say France, was Franz. And Omar, because a lot of the East Indians in the Caribbean were Muslim. And when you think about Omar and its relationship to his Hebrew origins, then it means not only he who is good with words, okay, but it's also connected to this question of that person through words who bring social change. Well, Frans Omar Fanon was dying. And so he decided to write a few books before he died. Well, he ended up only writing one, because he wrote in 10 weeks. It was Le Damné de la Terre. And the reason I think it's important to translate it as the damned of the earth is because, you see, in English, wretched has a different meaning. You see, when you think about damned, you can now get into its etymology. Damned is from Adamah, and it means of the earth. So he's saying those of the earth twice. To be damned also, damné, it means that you could be damned even if you didn't do something to warrant it. So what he's trying to bring up is the extent to which what is suffered in the global south, at that time they said the third world, what the people of the continent were dealing with was a circumstance in which they were pushed into a proverbial hell. And in fact, in his first book, he said the reason it's a zone of non-being is because there's no hell into which blacks can go. How are you going to go to hell if you're already there? But of course, here Fanon is also being poetic. Because if you think about the images of hell, you could think about, for instance, Dante's Inferno. And those of you who have not read Dante's Inferno, you should. It's a spectacular poem. And in fact, a lot of the images you know about hell in Christianity are actually from Dante's poem. They're not from the Bible. It's always funny as a Jewish guy talking to Christians, because when I explain a lot, because I'm also a professor of Jewish studies and religion, one of my best bus rides was, I ended up in a bus one time with a group of evangelical Christians. And we had a great bus ride because for 2 hours, we were talking about so many things that they thought in the Bible that just didn't exist. But a lot of what people believe is from this poem. But what's interesting in the poem is to bear in mind. Because you see, the character in the poem is so scarred, he's looking for revenge. And as he goes through different layers, limbo, all the others, he eventually gets to the center of hell. And the center of hell is cold, it's not hot. Because you see, hell is supposed to be the farthest distance from God. And if you're the farthest distance from God, it is very cold. And near the very center where he saw, you know, the devil or whatever, there were these two men. One of them was one of the most evil people who ever existed. He was a religious leader. And the other one, after suffering the brutality of what this religious leader did to his family, hated him so much that although they were frozen from the neck down, he stretched his head over and began to chew on the man's skull. And the protagonist in the Inferno, seeing this sight, what being consumed by hatred does, was released of his attachment to hate. And suddenly, the guide, Virgil, showed him the way out of hell. And it says a beautiful ending. He walks out and he sees the stars at dawn. It's a great metaphor. Well, if you look at Fanon, the damned of the earth, Fanon walks you through that hell. He starts off with violence, and he points out that violence is only brought up if you threaten those in power. You know, it's very interesting when people talk about nonviolent movements. People talk about the South African liberation struggle as nonviolent. They talk about the civil rights movement in the United States as nonviolent. But they only call it nonviolent because all the people who were being killed were black. Violence only begins if you start killing white people. So the first thing that Fanon points out is that if you're going to change, you're now caught in a catch-22. Because you see, if you're dealing with the settler population takes the position that they have the right to what they have. They don't say, I have stolen land. They don't say that I possess what I have on carnage. They say, I have the legal deed to my property. Now you take what's called the native people, the people who were there before. What they say is, you may have the deed, but that was my land. How am I going to get my land back? Well, the answer is make sure you do it nonviolently. But the problem is, violation is defined as getting something unjustly. So now you have a catch-22. What Fanon says, a lot of people miss this. He says decolonization is always violent. People think what he means by that is the evisceration, the beating up, the shooting of people. That's not what he means. That happens, but that's not what he means. He means that someone has to lose. See, one people may broker a situation. The only thing that will satisfy one group is if there's no change at all, which means ongoing violence. The only thing that's justice for another group is to change it, which for the initial group means violence. So it becomes irrelevant and a waste of time to prove you're nonviolent. But then Fanon goes to a next point. His next point is that and this is the part people miss. He detested violence. His next point was this. It's naive to think that violence in and of itself is going to make the change that's needed. Because you see, what you face when you do try to create a decolonization moment is you face what I call this the Moses syndrome. Now, if that transition is something on which I could give a long lecture on its own. But this, I was talking to Feroz earlier about, this is connected to something back in 1956. In 1956, when Fanon was at the Black Writers Congress, it was the year that Bourgeoisie Noire by E. Franklin Frazier was published. And he subsequently translated it into English as Black Bourgeoisie. One of the problems that happened in the decolonization moment was a selling out of the transition by undermining the very conditions to have a genuine black bourgeoisie. So what you have, in fact, is a lumpen black bourgeoisie. A lumpen black bourgeoisie is a bourgeoisie called, but not in fact. It's a group whose wealth and resources are not linked to the material transformation of the society that would lead to the building up of the infrastructure of the nation. It's people whose wealth is purely and simply a function of one thing, mediating the relationship between blacks and whites. And so what happens in that decolonization moment is what he doesn't call this, but I call this the Moses syndrome. Now, what Jews do at Seder's is we talk about the Holocaust, not the Holocaust, we do, but we talk about the Exodus. And what many people don't realize is Moses wasn't permitted to enter the Promised Land. The reason he wasn't is because he committed an act in which he said, look what I did for you. But if you're involved in a struggle, it's not what I did for you. The idea is that every revolutionary must understand that it's not about him or her. It's about the project that's greater than him or her. In the biblical sense, it's about God. Well, the Moses syndrome in a lot of struggles is this. The people who fight to create the independent state, the people who lead to the post-colonial state, say, look what I have done for you. But what Fanon is raising as a critical question in Le Damné de la Terre is this. Those whose skills are best for decolonization are not necessarily those with the right skills to build a nation. In fact, the big problem is those people might be in the way. Because if their skill set is the moment of decolonization struggle, then their legitimacy depends always on having what? An enemy. And that's why it uses xenophobia, racism, and over this continent right now, there are classes of people who are being constructed as enemies in a fictional notion of African societies that actually is not what the societies were before. You had pre-colonial Africa, and then colonialism came. Pre-colonial Africa is frozen. Then after struggles, you get rid of the colonizer, and then people look around and say, where did we leave off? The problem with that view is that, you see, it's premised upon another fiction called primitivism. It's premised on the notion that there are people who belong in a different time. But you see, when colonizers show up, when they meet the people they're colonizing, that moment is a shared time. And if you are struggling against your colonization, then you are using your values and transforming them into values that are actually part of this time. So when you think about, you see the African concepts that many of you use, in the South African context I talk about Ubuntu, but there are many other concepts. You're actually dealing with them fully, completely part of the modern struggle. And it's because those concepts have the capacity to expand and engage and remind you of who you are when you fight. And this is something crucial because, you see, what's often forgotten when we talk about these issues is many of us, remember when I talked about that theory experience thing? Many of us have a false history of who we are. A few years ago, there was celebration of the British ending the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. And at that time, I was the president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association. I was invited to speak all over the place around emancipation issues. Now, here's what's very interesting. Everywhere I went, if you look at the metropole, the colonial center, the story, and the story that's fed to most of us in the world, is that one day some very, very good moralistic white people said, you know, slavery is bad. We should end it. However, everywhere I went, you found out a very different local story. There is no, I'm not kidding, there's no instance of the ending of enslavement or colonization that I've come across that did not come about because the people struggled for it. So why is there a misrepresentation of the history to make the people believe we do not fight? And I'll give you an example. I'll pick one that's very different from the context you know. Pick one of the Virgin Islands. If you were to go to Denmark, I forget the name of the governor now, but there's a statue of a governor. And if you see there's a governor standing up and it says below, he ended slavery in the Danish world. Huh? Peter for Chelsea. But the real story is a rather fascinating one. When he was governor, what actually happened was the fort, they used the enslaved people to bring in them the supplies. Well, each day, as the enslaved people brought in the supplies, they were slowly changing the gunpowder with sand. So one day when the governor woke up, he looked outside and there were all of these black people wearing white. And some of you may know that white is the symbol of death in that world. That's what you wear to funerals. They had cutlasses, all kinds of weapons. They stood up and the governor came and he said, disperse. And the people just looked at him. And he said, if you don't leave, we're going to fire on you. So he ordered all the soldiers to aim the guns. And the people stood there. And then he said, fire. And when they did, it was sand. None of the guns worked. And suddenly he looked as they were surrounded by all of these people. And he said, well, you're all free. Now, of course, given the way the laws worked then, because he was the law as the governor, that meant the island was in effect free. Now, of course, there's a sad end to the story. They didn't want the island anymore. They sold it to the U.S., and the U.S., for a brief period, there was a lot of freedoms on the island, and the U.S. implemented its kind of apartheid and all of that stuff. But the main point is that there was always a fight for freedom. And so one of the things Fanon points out, you could connect it back to even the domestic abuse stories. You see, if you don't fight for your freedom, then you're always held hostage to the possibility of return domination. So part of your dignity, your humanity, and is for you to stand up for who you are. But the thing that Fanon did was then Fanon argued that every generation has its mission. And what Fanon means by this is, if we get back to that example, you see, the problem is the population trained for decolonization. If they continue those practices, you're going to have a society built on pathology. The ending of the book does something very unusual. He gives case studies of showing the brutality of violence on both sides. In other words, he showed not only that the French were torturing, but he also showed the kind of killings that were being done by Algerians. And the question is, if you're trying to do a propaganda that creates heroic revolutionaries of violence, why do you show stories of little boys killing their best friend, of a man thinking of his mother and eviscerating a woman? Why do you tell these stories? And what Fanon is trying to tell you is that you cannot build a society on trauma. So if you're going to, there's something that's rather interesting. What younger generations need is a conception, a telos, a maturation process in which they see the uniqueness of the responsibility they have for the world they're building. And within that framework, then, it means that those who ushering the new post-colonial moment, they must now be overcome. So you have this ongoing practice, and in fact, praxis that's needed. And within that framework, Fanon, if you want to use old language, was trying to argue now for what's called an open dialectic. A closed dialectic is the old kind of Marxist thing that says, you know, you have one group fight, you now expand the universal, another group will take over, and you have freedom. Fanon says it doesn't work that way. Because if you use that model, you're going to be stuck with the old argument of why those in suffering, those in bondage, those under difficult conditions must always wait. But Fanon says that that is just like that old argument of imposing one model as a shoe, the one shoe that fits all. There's a reason Martin Luther King wrote Why We Can't Wait. There's a reason the Haitians fought. Every group has to understand that it has the responsibility to set the conditions for its freedom and its emancipation. So in effect, what Fanon closes Le Damné de la Terre with, and it comes back to this very important issue, is that he argues that it's not enough to fight for material change. You need also to set the conditions for very new concepts. The conditions that led to where we are actually brief blips in the history of our species. But what the direction in which it will go completely depends on every one of us here. So in effect, Fanon is arguing for the kind of responsibility we take over the very knowledge we have as the oxygen through which to set afoot the new humanity. Well, that very creative young man ended up dying on December 6th, 1961 in Bethesda, Maryland. And what's very unusual is that if you look at one of his plays, he described the question that he struggled with. He said he did not want to collapse into the whiteness. But he did collapse into the whiteness. And how strange it was, because leukemia is about white blood cells, isn't it? How strange it was that he faded into white. But his book, as we know, Le Damné de la Terre, became the textbook of the revolution. It became a text that people began to read in a way, because what they didn't understand is that Fanon was really talking to everybody. And what Fanon understood is something that a lot of people miss. It tells you that the universal and truth is white, but Fanon has shown that that is actually one perspective. But the black perspective is very different. It's not that the black perspective is complete. It's that the black perspective realizes that it has a relationship to other perspectives. And that means that it knows it's not the universal. It is that which is struggling in a universalizing activity, precisely because as human beings, our task is never done. It's just that we're building, struggling, fighting always to make it better.
Would you speak to the non-beingness, if my understanding of what you were saying was correct, and this is just my understanding, the non-beingness of certain sections of humanity today, whether they be at tribal level, and I use that word in the most derogatory manner, or they be at the religious level as relates to terrorists, or where we have what seems to be non-beings of both tribal and religious. So for example, being ethnic Somali is a double non-being and an intrusion, especially if you're a male black Somali young man. Would you speak to that, please?
I would have left here without having been healed if you didn't talk about trauma, because history of Mau Mau, you have gone to the slavery. The entire Africa is very powerful trauma manifesting all over, and Fanon talk about that psychology of violence. No, my question is, we are talking about Fanon. They have not emerged another generation that can help to deconstruct or be like Fanon. What's happened? Is it that trauma that is still enslaving us? And that's why we are here. And even you can see many of us, we are middle class here.
Fanon was a Pan-Africanist. When he came to Africa, he was on the mission of unifying Africa, at the time. Now, looking forward 50 years after he wrote The Wretched of the Earth, and a lot of what he talks about in that, in terms of you have the bourgeois now taking over and desiring what the white master had, and now they've taken over. And if you look at today's society, that's exactly what has happened. And still at the same time, the idea of a united African nation still hasn't come about. Now, if Fanon was here, and just as you said before, he'd be disappointed that he was right, what do you think he would basically, based upon that diagnosis, what do you think he'd propose as a way of both overcoming that new white master? The white master has become black, and also that African unity has not been achieved. How do we move forward from here, if you are part of this generation that needed to establish a mission for them to either fulfill or betray? Thanks.
We're struggling here with a rapid turnover of our leadership, particularly political leadership, that seem to change completely their DNA when they move from movements to occupying public office. And I wonder whether there's anything with Fanon's analysis that could help us with deconstructing that and transforming that reality.
We're all here today because somebody paid a price. And those were the likes of Fanon and the likes of Malcolm X, all those people. And my question is, do you think, so there is the third liberation that is running Africa and is running the world right now. And this is the liberation of the young people. And they're innovators, all that stuff. I'm a social entrepreneur myself. Do you think the third liberation or the third revolution is a socio-economic revolution?
So one, to say thank you, also to affirm my thinking that I do not have to always attach myself to some thinker somewhere who is almost always white to say that, okay, therefore I think this because so-and-so also said it. To affirm that it's okay, that I could have a completely divergent view that is not necessarily attached to someone else. And that's okay. And that it's also okay to, be angry with the situation. In the moment, I think that we lose the ability to get upset with injustice. I think we have, gone a bit farther. if you would kindly speak about, and philanthropy, and you know, the question of how philanthropy, and I say this a lot, I know people who've ever been in a place where I am, I always ask about money. And why I ask about money is because I also feel that that also desensitizes and depoliticizes almost everything, because when you put money in, you know, it's becomes something else. So anyway, philanthropy, democracy, if anyone's thinking about what political systems work in our system, I don't think democracy is one of them, but maybe it is, and I just highly doubt it. So philanthropy, democracy, question of anger and emotion and feeling things.
If Frantz Fanon was alive today, what do you think he would think of Bob Geldof and trying to save Africa and dehumanizing Africans?
I wonder, in today's world, one wishes to probably imagine that in his time there was some orientation. Colonialism, you have to, you know, fight the settlers, kind of take over the state machine or whatever. But in today's world, what will Fanon at age 90, this observation over the time, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that it oriented radical politics at that time, in today's world, what will Fanon, what will have oriented Fanon, you know, as an example for the rest of us to follow?
You use the word decolonization. Maybe people who have the insight, may have the tools, may have the charisma to move a people from that state which they need to change, to change the status quo. And in modern day, that person is called the activist. And just what you mentioned echoed an article I read by a former classmate. You can Google it later, called "Hashtags Do Not Manufacture Revolutions." And he said there's a clear distinction between a leader and an activist. It's debatable, but I don't know, would you want maybe to comment more about that? Is it true that not all activists make good leaders because they're in a hangover of always having to deal with a certain issue, and once they move out of being stuck in a rut, they're left high and dry and they're wondering, okay, we've got it, what next? Thank you.
Ultimately, even though I spoke for a while, the most important part for me was to hear from you. And a lot of what each of you had to say are really connected. And so as I speak, I'm going to speak, instead of point by point, put it together into a single narrative. Okay? So the first thing to bear in mind is that one of the things that Fanon, remember I said that Fanon wanted to be wrong. The other thing Fanon would highly encourage, and this may sound very unusual, but he would also argue that we need to transcend him. In other words, that he was part of articulating a problem that was indigenous to certain social conditions, but we must take seriously, look around us, pay attention to the problems we face, okay? If we're facing his problems, it means that we have failed actually to make ourselves indigenous to our times. One of the big problems many intellectuals have, for instance, and I see it all over the continent and all over the global south, is that when we think about intellectual work, many intellectuals treat their ideas and their institutions that produce those ideas as if they are independent of the hegemonic, the colonial, and the political situations at hand. If you look at South Africa, for instance, a big problem in South Africa, and it's also a problem in Kenya, is that a lot of the universities during colonialism, a lot of the universities during apartheid saw themselves as independent. So that means then, if you are going to be post-apartheid, they don't see why they have to change because they thought they were not apartheid to begin with. And so if they don't change, that means you have an educational and an intellectual apparatus that is actually linked to colonial practices. Now, an example of this, and this is something very crucial to understand. Remember when I talked about what it is to be a human being? Well, if we take being a human being seriously, we take seriously the problem of what happens when we try to dehumanize human relations. See, models that really tell you not to be angry or not to be humorous, the error they make is they miss something, and this is something Anna Julia Cooper wrote about as well. You see, if you laugh, it means you get the joke. If you get the joke, it means you understand. So there's a pedagogical value in humor. If you're angry, it means you understand the problem. I had a debate many years ago. It was a very funny one. I was having a debate about, whether we should have black studies in the universities. And the opposition had a great argument. He said, we shouldn't have black studies because it makes students angry. And you can imagine my response. And what's wrong with that? Because you see, what are students anyway? Well, students are people who come to learn. And if you come to learn, the person who's teaching you, you hope, is committed to learning. That means if that person doesn't know something, that person should admit it or go and seek learning it. Teachers who tell you that a certain format of knowledge is complete and there's nothing more to learn are lazy intellectuals. And so when students take black studies, they're concerned because there's this whole world of knowledge that existed, but when they don't put the word black, they don't hear about it. If you take a class that says politics, there are people on the African continent studying politics and never talk about Africa. There are people on the continent studying philosophy, and they never talk about philosophy in Africa. There are people, we could go down the list. There are even in some that's supposed to be progressive areas. There are people who take courses in feminist theory and on gender, and they never, ever come to the framework of dealing with the lives of people of color. If you take a black studies class, say, on philosophy, you don't only learn about black philosophers, you also read white philosophers, because black philosophers are arguing in a relationship with white philosophers. You learn about Asian philosophers, about Indian philosophers. It's the same thing when you take almost black anything. If you notice, you can't study anything black without it being black and. And that's because, you see, the hubris of whiteness is whiteness tells you if you're white, you're pure. But if you're pure, it means it's cleansed of everything else. So you don't have to be in a relationship with anything else. It's a fiction. If you deal with the question of blackness, you are admitting you're in a relationship with something else. So what happens is, the first premise is the philosophical anthropology that Fanon was arguing for is the human being not as a thing, not as a substance, not even as an individual. The human being is a relationship. You know, when I give that example about experience and thought, you notice I said you go to someone? It's because all of us, we are relationships. If you had no relationships from birth, you wouldn't even be able to figure out who or what you are. We are creatures in a world of language, communication. We're in a social world. We're in a world of culture. We are relationships. So even those models that try to wipe away our relationship to people who are brown, white, whatever color we like, that won't work. We're all relationships. Now, this begins to connect to something very crucial, because you see, the question you asked is a question that is a question about what's called theodicy. For those of you who don't know what theodicy is something that every one of you who may believe in a God faces every day, and that is this: if God exists, why is the world so terrible? Everybody who's religious faces that question. If God exists, why do innocent people get killed? Why do terrible people get rich? Why do terrible people get protected? Why are there people who get eviscerated, destroyed? If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, why is there evil? Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that if you take God out the picture, if you look carefully, that argument continues. Because you see, there are two ways when God is in the picture that people respond. The first way goes all the way back to an African by the name of St. Augustine. A lot of people forget when they study St. Augustine that he was African. And St. Augustine had two classic responses that were later taken up by Leibniz and other thinkers. The first response, you all have heard it. The first response is, who the hell are you to question what God does? You finite being. Who are you to question God? You don't know what God's plan is. In other words, the problem is not God, it's you. The second response is, you know what? God gave us freedom, and then we botched it up. In other words, God is still good. We are the ones who are bad. You see? Now, if you take God out of the picture, look carefully what tends to replace God. What tends to be replace God are systems, systems of knowledge, governments, particular groups. And so it takes the same form. Who are you to question the society, the system of justice, science, whatever it may be? Maybe there's something wrong with you. Or the system really works. It's just that you're no good. In other words, it goes back to what Du Bois, Richard Wright, Fanon, all of them said. The response is to make you the problem instead of addressing the problem. So when we think about those different groups, we have to take seriously that if we take people out of relationships, then we're treating people like godlike entities. And then human beings have to be in the world as if we're completely self-sufficient and separate from each other, instead of dealing with the reality that we're in this together. Now, once we begin to make that move, this begins to connect to a lot of the questions that many of you asked. Because you see, if Fanon says the question is to transcend that, it means we have to get rid of some complexes. I already mentioned the Moses syndrome, but the Moses syndrome is connected to the Messianic syndrome. The Messianic syndrome is the belief that someone has to come and save you. The great leader, Fanon, was a radical Democrat. He believed in participatory democracy. He believed in collective responsibility for the society. At the end of the day, although charismatic leaders are charismatic, they may have good ideas, they have a particular function. No institution can work, no idea, no structure, without human beings making them work. And that means then the responsibility for that world is not waiting for who's going to come save us. It means we have to get up and do the work ourselves. We have to take something very seriously. And one of the things we have to take very seriously is that we live under conditions that are already a radically different world. And let me explain. One of the things, if Fanon were to come up, Fanon would be making a mistake if he looks at the paradigms of the 1950s and 60s. And one of the reasons for that is, first of all, let's begin with population. Our planet now has 8 billion people on it. You know what 8 billion people means? It means, whether we like it or not, we live on a smaller planet. The second thing to bear in mind is that we live in a period right now of the technological means of knowledge, of communication, information, and ideas moving at a nanosecond. That means distance is very different for everybody, even the poor, believe it or not. There are people, for instance, if they take a trip anywhere, and it takes more than 3 days to get there, they are pissed off. There was a world in which people say, I'm going to take a quick trip, it'll take 3 years. Even our expectation of time is different from generations that preceded us. And now within that framework, you now add to it the fact that we also are not, since we're relationships, we're not by ourselves in these struggles. So for instance, when we raise the question of Pan-Africanism, we have to understand the very history and the conditions. What is Africa in a context like that? You see what I'm saying? And in a context like that, you add another context. The other context is now we look at the former governors. If you look at the former governors, they are at war with two reactionary concepts. The first one is neoconservatism. Neoconservatism basically says that people are not capable of governing themselves, And for the world to function well, you need first and foremost and above all else, order. You see? And if you take the position that order must reign supreme, that's when, if you push it to its extreme, you know what that is. It's fascism. If you bring it back a little, you're going to be obsessed with security, military forces, police. And in fact, look at the language of police use today. The language the police use today is a language of unaccountability. They don't see themselves in a republic under which they are also governed by laws. They see themselves randomly as the laws. And under those conditions, there are people willing to abrogate law for the sake of maintaining order that leads to an effort, in fact, to push humanity conceptually into the 17th century. 17th at best, 18th century. And that's why if you look at the ideology that informs that stuff, it's Hobbes, Locke, those kind of people. Then you have neoliberalism. Now people use the word neoliberalism a lot, but they don't explain it. But you see, if you look at neoliberalism, neoliberalism wants to push the idea of the non-relational individual. And in other words, they always say they believe in rights, but they always say individual rights. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't know the last time I was discriminated against as Lewis Gordon. I've been discriminated against as a black man, as a Jew, as an Indian, as an Arab. I've been discriminated against as many things. You're always discriminated against as a group. No woman in this room has ever been discriminated against as an individual. You're discriminated against as a woman. You're discriminated against as gay. You're discriminated against as poor. Those are groups. So any system that's going to tell you you can only exist in it as an individual has made you vulnerable for exploitation. And in neoliberalism, the theology of neoliberalism, the theodicy is the market. And under the framework of the market, purely as individuals, you don't have any resource through which to deal with the accumulated structures of privatization against you. Now, within that framework, that means ultimately neoliberalism says, you know what? Our response to the revolutionary movements of the 20th century is what? Go to the 19th. You see how both are turning the clocks back. But some people respond to these efforts to turn the clock back, neoconservatism and neoliberalism. And if you look at neoliberalism, neoliberalism, because it works with that individualism, works within a moralistic logic. You know, many of us don't pay attention to this, but it makes absolute sense why President Mandela emerged, why President Obama emerged. You know, when Obama was running for president, man, I lost a lot of friends. Because everything I said in 2007 was correct. The world we have now is exactly what I predicted. And I remember at the time, because you see, what people wanted from Obama was for him to be a god. We have to let go of our ego. We have to let go of misunderstanding who we are and who am, and understand the relationships we have for something greater than ourselves. It means then there are some things that need to be done whether you individually succeed or not, because the only foundation for the future is going to be the actions we articulate, build, and struggle and forge to make happen. Whoa. Thank you.
That's very cool. Okay.